Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into a pretty fascinating question.
Okay.
Why are some deaths mourned
Yeah.
while others are met with indifference or even
Right.
celebration? Our source material is this really thought-provoking YouTube video
Interesting.
that uses some pretty striking examples to kind of make its case.
Yeah, it's a complex issue. It touches on wealth disparity,
Mm,
corporate power, and even
right.
how the public perceives different kinds of threats.
Right off the bat, the video compares reactions to the death of Osama bin Laden
Mm-hmm.
with those to the death of a certain healthcare CEO.
Okay.
Now, I know that's kind of a loaded comparison,
Yeah.
but what's the core takeaway here for you?
Well, I think instead of just summarizing the events, the video uses those contrasting reactions to kind of point out something deeper.
Yeah.
It argues that public indifference, or even celebration in some cases, might stem from viewing certain figures as symbols of flawed systems.
Yeah.
It's less about the individual and more about what they represent in the public's mind.
That's a really interesting point. So
Yeah.
it's not about condoning violence, but rather
Yeah.
a reaction to perceived injustice on a grand scale.
Exactly. And I think the video uses the analogy of a stroke of a pen
Okay.
to illustrate how those in positions of authority
Yeah.
can inflict harm, not through physical violence,
Mm-hmm.
but through the decisions they make.
Okay.
Think about CEOs or politicians.
Right.
The video argues that their actions, often made behind closed doors,
Mm-hmm.
can have devastating consequences for millions.
I see where they're going with this.
Yeah.
But does the video offer any concrete examples to
Mm.
support this stroke of a pen idea?
It certainly does.
Okay.
One example it cites is insurance companies denying necessary medical care to maximize profits.
Right.
While it's not as dramatic as a bomb dropping,
Sure.
the end result,
Yeah.
loss of life,
Mm-hmm.
can be just as devastating.
So the video is arguing that there's this disconnect between the seemingly mundane actions of those in power and then the very real suffering those actions can cause.
Precisely, and it goes a step further.
Okay.
By introducing the concept of the illusion of choice,
Okay.
it argues that while those in power may appear to have options,
Yeah.
they're actually constrained by a system that prioritizes profit above all else.
So even if someone wanted to make ethical choices,
Right.
the system itself pushes them towards prioritizing profit over people.
Yeah.
That's
It is.
that's a pretty bleak outlook.
It is, and the video doesn't shy away from that.
Yeah.
It points to things like corporate lobbying, campaign financing, specifically mentioning the Citizens United Supreme Court decision
Mm-hmm.
and the revolving door between government and industry as key factors that kind of perpetuate this system.
For those who might not be totally familiar with Citizens United, could
Yeah.
you unpack that a bit?
Of course, in a nutshell, the Citizens United decision allowed corporations to spend unlimited amounts of money on political campaigns.
Okay.
The video argues that this has led to a surge in lobbying, particularly by industries like oil and gas,
Right.
which then influences policy decisions and shifts the public debate on crucial issues like climate change.
So the video is suggesting that even our democratic processes are being warped by this system that prioritizes corporate interests.
That's the argument. And it ties us back to the idea of public apathy,
Okay.
claiming that our collective indifference to these issues allows them to continue unchecked.
Yeah.
We might get outraged by a news story about a specific instance of corporate greed,
Sure.
but then we go back to our daily lives without addressing the root causes.
It's like we're so overwhelmed by information and outrage that we become desensitized
Yeah.
to the larger systemic problem.
Absolutely, and it uses a really powerful comparison to illustrate this point.
Okay.
It contrasts the public outrage over looting during the 2020 protests, which caused $2 billion in damages,
Okay.
with the relative silence over wage theft by corporations,
Right.
which amounts to $40 billion annually.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's a huge.
That's 20 times the damage.
Yeah.
But because wage theft happens so quietly through paperwork and legal loopholes,
Right.
it doesn't trigger the same visceral reaction.
Exactly. The video argues that we're distracted by the flashy,
Yeah.
the violent, while the slow, grinding injustices go unnoticed.
Mm.
This selective outrage, it claims, is what allows harmful practices to continue.
So the video is painting a pretty grim picture here.
Yeah.
But where does the celebrating death part come in?
Right.
We've talked about systems and apathy, but how does that connect to
Yeah.
people's reactions when someone dies?
Well, the video argues that the celebration, or at least indifference surrounding the death of that healthcare CEO, wasn't personal.
Okay.
most people didn't even know his name.
Right.
It was about what he represented.
He was a symbol of a system that many people feel is rigged against them.
That's the core argument.
Okay. It was less about the individual and more about the pent-up frustration and anger directed at the system he embodied.
And the video claims that this wasn't just a fringe reaction.
Right.
It argues that the CEO's death was met with indifference by a large portion of the population.
That's right. And it attributes this to a growing awareness of the systemic issues we've been talking about.
Okay.
People are starting to see the connections between seemingly unrelated events, recognizing that decisions made in boardrooms and government offices have a direct impact on their lives.
So it's less about healthcare specifically and more about a broader feeling that the system is fundamentally broken.
Right.
That the rules are rigged in favor of the wealthy and powerful.
Exactly. And that feeling of powerlessness, of being trapped in a system you can't escape, can breed resentment, anger, and as the video warns, potentially even violence.
Now that's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
But before we dive into the potential consequences of this resentment, let's take a step back and address something you mentioned earlier.
Sure.
The historical context. The video talks about patterns of wealth inequality throughout history.
Right.
Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. The video highlights a recurring theme throughout history.
Okay.
Extreme wealth inequality coupled with economic hardship and a sense of hopelessness often leads to social unrest and violence.
Okay.
It uses powerful visuals, including graphs and a demonstration with grains of rice to illustrate the stark reality of wealth inequality in the United States.
I remember that rice demonstration.
Yeah.
A single grain representing the median net worth and then that mountain of rice.
Yeah.
For the ultra-wealthy, it was a powerful visual metaphor.
It was. And the video goes on to highlight some pretty hard-hitting statistics.
Okay.
For instance, it points out that the richest 1% of Americans now hold 40% of the nation's wealth.
Wow.
While over half the country can't afford a $1,000 emergency expense.
That's crazy.
The video warns that these trends are creating conditions ripe for unrest, drawing parallels to historical periods that experience similar levels of inequality.
So it's not just about the present moment.
Right.
The video is arguing that we're on a potentially dangerous trajectory based on historical precedent.
Exactly. It's a warning grounded in historical analysis.
Okay.
Suggesting that if these trends continue unchecked, we could be headed towards social and political upheaval.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've talked about the stroke of a pen analogy, the illusion of choice, public apathy, historical patterns, and the resentment that can build when people feel powerless within a system they perceive as unfair. But I'm still curious about the other examples the video uses to illustrate its point.
Sure.
You mentioned the death of a billionaire fashion CEO, right?
Let's delve into that example next. Good. It offers another perspective on how wealth disparity and the public perception of certain industries can fuel these complex reactions to death.
Sounds like it's about to get even more interesting.
It does.
Let's dig in.
Yeah. You know, the video makes a pretty compelling case about these systemic issues.
Yeah.
But it also uses the death of the billionaire fashion CEO to highlight another kind of interesting point.
Remind me about this one. It was the founder of that fast fashion brand, right?
Yeah.
The one who died in that hiking accident.
That's right. And the video points out that the public reaction to his death was far from sympathetic.
Okay.
A lot of people saw him as a symbol of wealth accumulated during a time when many were struggling financially.
So similar to the healthcare CEO, it wasn't about the person himself.
Right.
But rather what he represented.
Precisely, the video suggests that this reaction shouldn't be misinterpreted as simple envy or schadenfreude.
Okay.
It's about a deeper sense of injustice.
Right.
A feeling that the rules of the game are inherently unfair.
I think the video uses the phrase, it's okay to be rich and successful, but the degree and the context matters.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
That's a crucial point. The video isn't advocating for poverty or even for traditional wealth redistribution.
Okay.
It's calling for a more just and equitable society where everyone has a genuine chance to thrive.
Yeah.
Not just a select few.
That makes sense. It's not about demonizing wealth itself,
right,
but questioning a system that allows for such extreme disparities.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, the video uses a rather striking analogy.
Okay.
Imagine a lion hoarding thousands of carcasses.
Okay.
Far more than it could ever eat.
Right.
While the rest of the pride starves.
I see where they're going with this.
Yeah.
We'd recognize that as something unnatural, something wrong.
Precisely. The video argues that we're living in a similar situation where a small group of individuals controls a disproportionate amount of resources, while a significant portion of society struggles to meet basic needs.
And the video connects this back to that feeling of powerlessness we talked about earlier.
Right.
The sense the system is rigged and there's nothing you can do about it.
That's right. The video labels this hoarding of resources as a kind of cancer of greed, arguing that it's at the root of a host of problems.
Like what?
It cites environmental destruction, political corruption, and of course, social unrest as just a few examples.
Oh, okay.
It's suggesting that these issues are interconnected, stemming from this fundamental imbalance in the system.
It's like that saying, the love of money is the root of all evil.
The video doesn't use that exact phrase, but the sentiment is similar.
Okay.
It argues that our current economic and political systems incentivize this relentless pursuit of profit, often at the expense of people and the planet.
Okay, so we've talked about these broad systemic issues.
Yeah.
But the video also keeps circling back to the healthcare CEO's death. Why does it seem to focus so heavily on that specific example?
I think the video uses the healthcare CEO as a microcosm of these larger issues. It highlights the fact that healthcare in the United States is a business.
Right.
And a very profitable one at that.
Yeah.
And the video argues that this profit motive creates perverse incentives.
Can you give me an example of what you mean by perverse incentives?
Sure. The video claims that the CEO's job, in essence, was to find ways to choose money over stopping pain, suffering, and death.
Okay.
And for that, he was reportedly paid $30,000 a day.
That's a stark contrast to the experiences of so many people who are struggling to afford basic medical care, facing financial ruin because of medical bills or even being denied care that they desperately need.
Exactly. And the video uses this contrast to highlight the fundamental disconnect between the lived realities of most people and the priorities of those in power.
There's a detail in the video that I found particularly jarring.
Okay.
It mentions that the healthcare CEO died at an investors meeting, not a patient's meeting.
That detail is meant to drive home the point that profit, not patient well-being, was the primary focus.
So the video is essentially saying that the system itself is set up to prioritize profit over people.
That's the argument. And the video cites a number of examples to support this claim.
Okay.
It points to instances of insurance companies denying necessary care, delaying treatments, and engaging in other cost-cutting measures that ultimately prioritize the bottom line over patient outcomes.
It's no secret that the United States spends far more on healthcare than any other developed country, yet our health outcomes are often worse.
Right.
The video seems to be saying that this isn't a coincidence, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
The video argues that the high cost and often poor quality of healthcare in the United States are directly related to the fact that the system is designed to extract profit, not to deliver optimal care.
But isn't there a lot of rhetoric about fixing the system? Don't those in power claim to be working towards solutions?
They do, but the video is highly critical of that rhetoric. It argues that a lot of it is just PR spin and misleading language designed to deflect blame and avoid accountability.
Do you remember any specific examples of this kind of rhetoric?
There's a quote from the CEO's boss that the video highlights.
Okay.
He claimed to be super proud to be part of an organization that does so much good for so many.
Right.
And talked about guarding against the pressures to deliver unsafe or unnecessary care.
I see what they're doing there.
Yeah.
They're framing themselves as the protectors of patients while simultaneously maximizing profits.
Exactly. The video deconstructs this type of language, arguing that these executives aren't victims of the system, but rather architects of it. They're the ones shaping policies and practices that often result in harm.
So they're profiting from the very problems they claim to be trying to solve.
That's the point the video is making. And it extends this critique to the media as well.
What role does the media play in all of this, according to the video?
It criticizes the media for perpetuating these myths and shielding those in power from scrutiny. It points to the puff pieces that were published about the healthcare CEO after his death. Articles that lauded his leadership and downplayed the negative impacts of his company's policies.
So the video is arguing that the media, whether intentionally or not, often serves to protect the powerful and maintain the status quo.
That's the essence of its critique.
Okay.
It argues that this kind of sanitized coverage prevents the public from fully understanding the scope of the problems and the urgent need for change.
It's like we're being gaslit by those in power and by a media system that often amplifies their messages. But if the video is right and more people are starting to see through this, where does that leave us?
Well, the video suggests that this growing awareness, while potentially leading to anger and resentment, also creates an opportunity for change.
Okay.
It calls for a rejection of these dominant narratives and a shift towards a more people-centered approach.
But the video doesn't just focus on systemic issues, right? It also touches on personal responsibility. How does it reconcile these two seemingly conflicting ideas?
That's a great point. The video acknowledges that individual choices matter, even within a flawed system.
Okay.
It uses a thought-provoking comparison between the fear of robbery and the lack of outrage over larger-scale theft through corporate practices.
Can you elaborate on that comparison?
Sure. The video points out that robbery evokes a strong, visceral reaction, a sense of violation, and many people go to great lengths to protect themselves from it.
Right.
However, statistically, robberies represent a tiny fraction of the total theft that occurs each year.
And the video claims that the majority of this theft comes from corporations exploiting their workers and the environment.
Exactly. Now, whether you agree with the video's characterization of those practices as theft is up for debate.
Sure.
But the point is that we often focus our energy on protecting ourselves from relatively minor threats while ignoring much larger, more systemic ones.
It's like we're obsessed with locking our doors and installing security systems while our house is slowly being eroded by termites.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
We're so preoccupied with the immediate, the visible threats, that we often fail to see the insidious damage happening on a larger scale.
So how does the video suggest we reconcile this individual focus on security with the need to address these larger systemic issues?
It advocates for a shift in perspective instead of getting caught up in culture wars and other forms of manufactured outrage.
Okay.
We need to redirect our energy towards addressing the underlying economic and political forces that are driving inequality and injustice.
It's about recognizing that our real enemy isn't each other, but the system that pits us against one another while those at the top profit.
Precisely. And the video outlines several ways to push back against this system.
Like what specific actions does the video recommend?
Well, it calls for holding those in power accountable, demanding transparency from corporations and government institutions, and refusing to accept empty promises and PR spin.
So it's about becoming more informed and engaged citizens.
Right.
Demanding better from our leaders and institutions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it also emphasizes the importance of individual choices.
Like what kind of choices?
It encourages supporting businesses that operate ethically, even if it means paying a bit more.
Okay.
Consuming media critically.
Right.
And being aware of the biases that shape the information we receive.
It's about being conscious consumers and citizens, making choices that align with our values.
Right. And the video stresses the importance of engaging in our communities.
Okay.
Supporting organizations that are working to create a more just and equitable world.
So it's not just about individual actions, but about collective action as well.
Absolutely. The video argues that change won't happen overnight, and it won't come from any single source. It requires a multifaceted approach that addresses both systemic issues and individual behaviors.
It's about understanding that we're all interconnected, that our actions have consequences, and that we have a collective responsibility to create a better future. But before we wrap up, there's one element we haven't discussed yet.
Okay.
The role of technology.
Ah, yes, the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
The video barely touches on technology, but it's impossible to ignore its impact on our world.
I mean, think about it. Social media amplifies outrage, often misdirecting it.
Right.
Algorithms create echo chambers that reinforce our existing beliefs, making it harder to have productive conversations across different perspectives.
And then there's the whole issue of automation and AI, which are already displacing workers and potentially exacerbating economic inequality.
Yeah.
How do these technological forces intersect with the themes the video explores?
That's a deep dive for another day.
It is.
But it's definitely food for thought. How can we harness the power of technology to create a more just and equitable society.
Right.
Rather than letting it worsen the problems we're facing.
That's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
It requires us to be both critical and creative.
Yeah.
To understand the limitations of technology
Mm-hmm.
while also exploring its potential for positive change.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From the psychology of outrage to the complexities of personal responsibility.
Yeah.
We've discussed historical patterns and even touched on the looming influence of technology.
Right.
Where does all this leave us? What are your final thoughts on the video's message?
I think the video, despite its bleakness at times, ultimately offers a message of hope.
Okay.
It suggests that if we can overcome our divisions, focus on root causes,
right,
and hold those in power accountable, we can create a more just and equitable world.
Yeah.
But it's not going to be easy.
You're right. It requires us to be engaged, informed, and willing to challenge the status quo. It requires us to recognize our own agency, even within a flawed system.
Right.
And use that agency to demand better.
And perhaps most importantly, it requires us to cultivate empathy.
Okay.
To see the world through the eyes of others.
Yeah.
And understand that our fates are intertwined.
Well said. This deep dive has given me a lot to think about.
Yeah, me too.
What about you? What are some key takeaways that stood out to you?
For me, the video's central message is about the need for a fundamental shift in perspective.
Okay.
We need to move beyond the narrow confines of self-interest and embrace a more holistic view of society, one that recognizes the interconnectedness of our challenges and the importance of collective action.
It's about understanding that we're all in this together, whether we like it or not.
Exactly. And that realization, I believe, is the key to unlocking a better future.
Well said. And on that hopeful note, we'll wrap up this deep dive.
Okay.
But as always, we leave you with a final thought to ponder. The video talks about the stroke of a pen as a metaphor for the power of those in authority.
Right.
But what about the power of our own voices? How can we use our voices collectively and individually to rewrite the narrative and shape a more just and equitable world? That's something for you to consider.
Until next time, keep diving deep.
You know, as we've been discussing the video's arguments, something that keeps coming to mind is the power of narratives. It seems like a key part of the problem is the disconnect between the stories we're told and the realities we experience.
That's a really astute observation.
Yeah.
The video actually touches on that very point.
Okay.
When it discusses the limitations of propaganda.
Okay.
It argues that propaganda, or any kind of manipulative narrative, can only contradict material reality for so long.
It's like trying to convince someone they're not hungry when their stomach is growling.
Right.
Eventually, the physical sensation overpowers any attempt at persuasion.
Exactly. And the video suggests that we're approaching a similar tipping point with many of the issues we've been discussing.
Okay.
The gap between the narratives spun by those in power and the lived realities of everyday people is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore.
So it's like people are starting to see through the smoke and mirrors, recognizing that the emperor has no clothes, so to speak.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
The video argues that this growing awareness is both a source of danger and opportunity.
Okay.
Danger because it can fuel frustration, anger, and potentially lead to social unrest, but also opportunity because it creates space for new narratives to emerge, for new solutions to be proposed, and for new ways of organizing society to be explored.
So we're at a crossroads. We can either succumb to the forces of division and chaos, or we can harness this collective awakening to build a more just and equitable future.
The video clearly advocates for the latter.
Okay.
It ends with a powerful call to action, urging viewers to reject the divisive tactics often employed by those in power. And to focus on our shared humanity.
It's about recognizing that we have more in common with each other than with the billionaires and corporations that often profit from our division and exploitation.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a reminder that ultimately power resides with the people.
Okay.
There's a line in the video that I found particularly striking.
Okay.
It says, "We are the many. We cannot be defeated. The only way to defeat us is if we defeat ourselves."
That's powerful stuff.
It is.
It's inspiring, but it also begs the question, how do we translate that potential power into concrete action?
Right.
The video offers some general suggestion, like holding those in power accountable and supporting ethical businesses.
Right.
But what are some other ways we can contribute to creating meaningful change?
That's where things get a bit more complex.
Oh, yeah.
There's no one-size-fits-all answer. The specific actions we take, will depend on our individual skills resources and the context we find ourselves in.
But the video does offer some guiding principles, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It emphasizes the importance of education,
Yeah.
of understanding the root causes of the problems we face. It encourages critical thinking, urging us to question the narratives we're constantly bombarded with,
Right.
and to seek out diverse perspectives and alternative sources of information.
So it's not about waiting for a charismatic leader to tell us what to do.
Right.
It's about taking individual responsibility for becoming informed, engaged citizens who can think critically and make informed choices.
Exactly. And the video also stresses the importance of community.
Okay.
Of coming together with others who share our values.
Yeah.
And working collaboratively towards creating change.
It's about understanding that we're stronger together.
Right.
That collective action can achieve what individual efforts often cannot.
Precisely.
Yep.
The video's message is that we all have a role to play, no matter how small.
Okay.
Even seemingly insignificant actions, when multiplied across millions of people, can create a powerful force for change.
This deep dive has certainly been a roller coaster of emotions.
It has.
We've explored some dark and uncomfortable truths
Yeah.
about human nature and the systems we've created. But we've also glimpsed the possibility of a brighter future.
Right.
What are your final thoughts?
I think the video, even with its critique of the current state of affairs, ultimately offers a message of hope.
Okay.
It suggests that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, hope remains. And that hope, coupled with informed action, can move mountains.
That's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
And this conversation has given me a lot to reflect on.
Me too.
I'm sure our listeners are feeling the same way.
Yeah, I hope so.
Well, it's been a pleasure diving deep into these complex issues with you. And for our listeners, we'll leave you with one final thought-provoking statement from the video.
Okay.
The historical pattern is clear. Do something more material. Stop being billionaires. Pay your employees more.
Wow.
It's a challenge, a call to action.
Yeah.
And a reminder that the power to create a more just and equitable world ultimately rests in our hands. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.